Okay, hello. I'm hoping that we're now live on LinkedIn. I'm going to tick on the corner of the box, and we've got a live on YouTube as well. So this is my very first live on both LinkedIn and on YouTube. So thank you for joining us. Today we'll be talking about the model minority myth, and we will be specifically talking about an outline today about the model minority myth. We'll be looking at this stereotype that is towards Asians and white matters. We will be given an insight to its impact on British South Asians at work, as well as an insight on how the impact of this stereotype plays out to Black and other communities. And you will learn how to bring this conversation into your workplace as well. So, yeah, I'm just checking that it is live. Brilliant. So if you are watching, do leave me a comment. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Now I know that it's working. Wonderful. So you can now, I will add myself to the feed, and lovely to see you. If you're watching, do leave me a comment. It helps me to know that you're here. You can hear what's going on, and also what is resonating with you, any questions that you've got as well. I will probably come to the comments at the end today, but also come back afterwards as well and answer any. And as we go, I will try to keep on top of them as well. So thank you. I'm live. Hooray. Okay, wonderful. So thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to let you know, that's me. I'm Anita Figura. My pronouns are she and her. I wanted to let you know that today we'll be talking about the model minority myth, and I'll be outlining what it is, and we'll talk about the harm that this stereotype creates and how it plays out in the workplace. What we're talking about today is a snapshot of a talk that I'm doing within organisations, particularly for South Asian Heritage Month. But you will also see that this is relevant to Black communities as well. And so if your organisation is interested for Black History Month, then pop me a message. But also these conversations that we can have all year round, either through talks or other ways of working together. And these Heritage Month and History Month are a great instigator for these conversations. But these are conversations we absolutely need to be having all year round. Thank you for the comments letting me know that it's worked. So what is the model minority myth? The model minority myth is a stereotype. It portrays Asians as kind of the right way to be a minority. It's associated with being reserved, hardworking, professional, and that could be within certain careers as well. So Asians are often associated in the UK with certain careers. That could be small business owners. When I grew up, there was a lot of an association with small retail and corner shops. But also part of the association is with certain careers and certain industries like medical professions, pharmacies, IT, technology, accountancy. And part of this stereotype also is there is the assumption that Asians are seen as a good way to be a minority. They are an example of a minority that has integrated well into society. Now, this is, as I've said, it's a stereotype, right? But that doesn't mean that we will go over about where the elements of truth come in from this stereotype. The stereotype is seen in quite positive. So why am I bringing this to you as the topic for South Asian Heritage Month? Am I celebrating that there is a right way to be a minority? Absolutely not. And we're going to talk about actually how this stereotype causes harm. It causes harm to Asian communities, and it causes harm to other communities as well. This stereotype, or the name, the model minority myth, I just want to also touch on the fact that today I will be using the phrase model minority myth as it's the name of the stereotype. It's the name of the myth as the clues in the name. But I don't often talk about ethnic minorities or minorities because the language implies a less than. But for the purposes of today, because of the context, I will be talking about it, but is in inverted commas. I prefer to talk about people being from underrepresented groups or ethnically diverse. I also do use people of colour and women of colour, but I know there are some opinions out there that prefer not to use those terms as well. But by my use of minority today is in the context of this stereotype. The coining of this phrase actually comes from America, and you will, if you look into it more, you will hear of, you can find out more about it, but particularly from an American point of view, and is often applied to East Asian communities in the context of America. But there are lots of parallels to both South Asians and East Asians in how they are viewed in Britain, and we'll be using that context today. There is going to be a bit more of a focus on South Asian communities, given that we're in South Asian Heritage Month, but there are lots of parallels. So I also want to introduce myself for those of you that don't know me, but also for those of you that do, because there are certain things that I think are relevant for today that you may well not know about me. So labels are part of our identity. They are how we perceive the world and how others perceive us. They give us a shared understanding with people that might have similar labels to us, but also they are, how we view the world and how others view us. But even when we share labels with people, it doesn't mean that we are the same as them either. There might be some shared experiences, but we're not the same as people with the exact labels as us. So some of my labels, I've told you I'm an East Figura. My pronouns are she and her. I'm British, I'm South Asian, I'm Indian, I'm Sikh, I'm female, I'm an introvert, and I'm so much more. I'm from Kent. I'm officially a Cockney, although I don't really own that label, but I was born in East London. I'm a Whovian, so I'm quite a Doctor Who fan. I'm a bit of a Marvel MCU nerd. Like I'm up to date with all of my Marvel. There's lots of my labels. Some of my labels put me as part of the majority group with people that I'm around. So I'm able-bodied. I'm cisgendered. I'm heterosexual. I'm neurotypical, although I'm sometimes questioning that as a label, as I'm understanding more about neurodiversity. So some of my labels put me with what is deemed as more the majority group, and sometimes how I perceive myself and how others perceive me might change with the people that I'm about. Sometimes my labels might be a push and a pull as well, but I can't show up with I show up with all aspects of my identity, and I can't necessarily separate those out, particularly the ones that are ingrained and are a core part of me. So I can't tell you necessarily today that some of my experiences have been because I'm a British person or because I'm a South Asian or because I'm a woman. That all of that comes together. It is a package, right? And that is the concept of intersectionality. I'm sure that we all have our own series of labels. And if you want to share some of yours in the comments, then I would love to hear them. But absolutely only share what you're comfortable with. You don't have to share your ethnicity if you don't want to, but if you would like to, share any kind of labels, whether you're part of the majority group or whether you're tends to be the not majority group. But again, it depends on who you're around, doesn't it? Whether that is the majority or not. So is this myth that we are talking about, is it grounded in truth? So we've said that this myth can do some harm, but is there some truth in it? We spoke about certain association with certain careers and professions for South Asians and to some respect East Asians as well. And yes, in some contexts there is some truth that is along with this myth and this stereotype, because we do see an overrepresentation in some industries of people from certain ethnicities. So for technology, for example, we do see more South Asians than compared to perhaps the general population. So there might be some cultural influences, some parental influences that we have that encourage us down certain paths. But Asians and Asian culture isn't a monolith. There is so much difference, even when we've already said it, even when we've got the same labels, even with it, like I've said, that my background, my heritage is Indian, even within that, there'll be so much diversity. And India itself is just a huge, diverse country in itself. So, of course, there's lots of diversity, even within that. But there does tend to be certain, in some Asian cultures, some things that we might share amongst ourselves. That might be that this sometimes includes a respect for authority. That might be something that we are taught or encouraged. We might be encouraged to be more reserved. We might be encouraged to be less outspoken. From my one of my labels that I didn't share earlier is that I'm a second generation immigrant. So that means my parents came into the UK. They actually came in the 60s when they were both children. They were educated in the UK. And I was then later on, I was born here. So all of that has shaped my upbringing, because my parents both have the mix of their Indian heritage, but also that Indian heritage within the context of being British and wanting to preserve their Indian heritage within that context. So some of the things the messages that I've had ingrained into me, whether that was explicitly or from other or unconsciously, and that's not just from my parents, but from the British context. I mean, the white dominant society, as well as parental influences and family and cultural references, which other Asians may share, or some may not as well. We've spoken about the respect to authority, for authority. One of the things that I have is, which I shared on a post recently and other people resonated with, is the little voice in my head that says, what will people think when I'm making decisions in life, the way I'm showing up? What will people think? Another is that, so what will people think? Another aspect is that certain aspects have been encouraged. So, to perform well at school, to exceed expectations, to work really hard, to strive for perfection. Now, whether that was intentional, but what has become ingrained in me, as I've discovered later in life, is that I am a perfectionist in certain areas. And when it comes to education and when it comes to my work, I was falling into the overachiever. And then that has had impact on mental health, that has had an impact on well-being. Other aspects that have these messages have also shaped in various ways are about perhaps shedding certain parts of my identity or how I show up in certain spaces and not showing my whole self, because that wouldn't be professional. Be in a certain way to fit in. So for that, there's been some assimilation, and I see it playing out even with my 5-year-old, who has started to reject some of his Punjabi culture, because he says, I'm not Punjabi, I don't want to learn that language, because at school, particularly when he went to nursery and it was white dominant space, he started recognizing, hold on, I'm different, and therefore why would I speak a different language? Another aspect that's been perhaps ingrained, whether that was again consciously, unconsciously, is the what will, that is not safe to be too visible, to be too outspoken. Don't put your head above the parapet, because that comes with risk. Now, I can see where this comes from my parents' generation, particularly now. With hindsight, I can see this. I can also see how it shaped my decisions and my upbringing and certain things in my adult life. But now I can see how where this comes from. Because for my parents' generation, coming into the UK as first generation immigrants in the 60s, and then as they grew up in the 70s and in the 80s, into adulthood and going into work, they had to assimilate. It was too dangerous to be themselves. There was much more overt racism. So that a message that's been passed on to me is, don't show up in a certain way. Don't be too outspoken. So naturally, I'm an introvert, or whether that's natural would be an interesting one to know. But there's also an element of don't be too outspoken. What are the risks that come with that? So we've spoken about this myth and how some of it may well be grounded in truth. That's not to say that there's a right way to be a minority, but that there is perhaps some of these elements of identity are associated with some aspects of culture. But as we've said, not all Asian cultures are the same. Even within my family, I can tell you, not everybody in my family had the same educational outcomes. Not everybody, even in my same household. My brothers are not reserved. They are extroverts. So even within this context, right, we are not all the same. But somehow I've kind of found myself, as I was looking into this, I was like, hold on, am I ticking a lot of the boxes that are associated with this stereotype? Even though that wasn't something I ever consciously strived for. So this stereotype absolutely causes harm to Asian communities. It shows up in many different ways, but it can create this pressure cooker of perfection that we've touched on. That can do us harm in ourselves. Racism is still happening to South Asians and East Asians. In the wake of COVID-19, there was a 300% increase in hate crimes. That was reported hate crimes towards Chinese, East and South Asians, as we've said, in the wake of COVID-19 in the UK. So racism is becoming more overt, and in this case, there was a trigger that we were, for East Asians in particular, but this has also affected, it led to more overt racism and hate crimes towards South Asians as well. So even despite perhaps assimilating and integrating into society, when something happens, there is a trigger, suddenly we realise that actually perhaps we were never accepted. September the 11th was a real wake-up call for me as a brown woman in the UK about racism suddenly becoming very overt. So perhaps I was never accepted. Now, so women are, this translates into our workplaces as well. And I'm going to talk specifically about women of colour, and I'm going to bring it back to Asian communities specifically as well. But this is where some of the statistics that I can show you are, and this is from the Forset Society, a recent report that they've done. So Asian women, as part of the group of women of colour, are experiencing racism in the workplace. Over 3/4 of women of colour have experienced racism, and that's impacted well-being, mental health, confidence, job satisfaction, progression opportunities, and their ability or desire to stay in their role. Racism in the workplace is a real issue, even where it may be less overt. And we are seeing a lot more statistics of many women, Black women, Asian women, and other women of colour ready to leave their roles. This is one study that shows that, but there are a number of studies that are showing this. So organisations, here's a message to you. I know we've got a mix of people in our audience today. We've got directors, we've got project leaders, we've got middle management, we've got DEI leaders and race equality network leaders. One of the focuses in your organisation, I implore you, needs to be about engaging and retaining people of colour, and particularly women of colour, because there is an epidemic that is happening right now. So many are dissatisfied and ready to leave. Bringing this back to the model minority myth, what we are also seeing is that actually many of these women, more women of colour compared to white women, were actually valuing being promoted over time. It was really important to them. But actually that wasn't playing out. That isn't what was happening. They were being passed over for promotion. And that is despite receiving frequent good feedback. So bringing this back to the model minority myth, even where we are told good things, you're told you're hardworking, there are these positive attributes, and you're receiving good feedback at work, that isn't resulting in the more positive outcomes of promotion, of pay gaps, of equitable pay. We are still seeing significant pay gaps. And when we break this down, and there are very few studies that aggregate data into different ethnicities, and then even amongst Asian communities. but we see a big difference in pay gaps, even amongst Asian women. So this is why we need the specific and nuanced conversations and interventions. We're also, another statistic, again by Foresight Society, found that women of colour were more associated with not being seen as an acceptable leader. Their face didn't fit around here. So that stereotype was actually wasn't leading to, those better outcomes. And particularly for Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage women, they were told that they were the ones that are being told more significantly that they don't have the right leadership qualities. So what are we doing to challenge these stereotypes that are happening in the workplace, to expand the definition of what leadership should look like? And here's a really interesting and very interesting statistic that was an interesting finding from this report. It was more women of colour, particularly those from Pakistani, Bangladeshi and Indian heritage women, that were reporting that was a manager that was blocking their progression at work. And if we're again tying this back to the model minority myth, part of the reason might be that people from South Asian descent, in this case women from South Asian descent, are seen as a threat. Particularly if they, with the model minority concept, this prevalent stereotype that is setting certain groups above other groups, part of that might be that then that's creating this perception of this group being a threat or being undeserving. So this model minority myth is causing harm to South Asian communities, which we've spoken about and we've shared. And we've broken it down into some cases how that is different between South Asian communities and how it plays out in different ways. This is absolutely also causing harm to Black communities as well. It is a way of pitting people against each other, pitting groups against each other. It's a way that can mask racism, particularly under what in the UK is often the BAME acronym. If some groups do have better outcomes, and in some cases Asian communities do have better outcomes, then that can be used as examples to say, well, we don't have a racism problem in the UK, or we don't have a racism problem in our workforce. Perhaps if you've got one or two Asian leaders in your team, then some organisations might be saying, well, we've addressed our BAME challenge in leadership. So this is a way that then kind of masks racism. It masks worse outcomes to other communities and in many instances to Black communities as well, or specifically. It's a way of masking anti-Black racism. It's also sometimes used as a way of saying, well, this group of people are all right. Look how well they've integrated. Look how they aren't speaking up about racism. And we've gone over some of the reasons that might be the case. But then it's used as a way to deny racism. It's used as a way to say, well, this group's okay, so there is no racism problem here. And so rather than us all working together to overcome anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism and other forms of racism, we've only gone over kind of two aspects today, but there are a lot more different forms of racism and xenophobia that's happening in the UK and in our workplaces, which is why we need to have nuanced and specific conversations. Rather than us all working together, it can be used as a way to pit groups against each other. It could be a way to make one group be more accepted and then have to behave in certain ways, or they get encouraged to disown other groups, or even within their communities, we can hear of, well, you're the exception, others aren't like you, so you get encouraged more to assimilate and be more like the white dominant environment wants you to be, disowning others which we are seeing in some of our political leadership at the moment. But but if anybody wants to talk to me about politics, that will be another conversation from today. But we are seeing that how this is harming Black communities and South Asian communities. So at the top of this talk, I spoke about how actually this topic is very relevant, not just for South Asian Heritage Month, but also Black History Month. And there are ways we can go much deeper into this topic. But also outside of these Heritage Months and History Months, these are conversations and interventions that we need to be having all year round. As this kind of message on the bottom is running, it shows that this is kind of a snapshot of this topic today. I have been doing talks for South Asian Heritage Month into organisations, particularly working with race equality networks, to give a more detailed and tailored talk. But yes, if you are interested in either having a talk within your workplace or different interventions, then it would be I'd really love to have a conversation with you and support you. And now I'm just going to have a look at the comments and just pick up any comments. If you have any questions, I will stay on kind of 5 minutes past if we need to. But thank you for those who, I'm just picking up those who shared their labels. I know, Hannah, you won't mind me sharing that up on the screen. But absolutely, huge Marbles fan as well. And I love this. Proud of being a child of an immigrant. And absolutely, it is something to be proud of, isn't it? Yes, the global majority are voting with their feet. Yeah. And the question I got asked the other day is, where do they go? And that's a really good question. Some of them may be going up to set up their own businesses. Some of them may be going, some of them actually may then end up stuck in organizations or roles that, that they are deserving better of. But actually, if you are not treating your staff well, your people of color, your global majority, as Hannah has said, and your women of color, they are no longer happy just to put up with it. So you're losing lots of talent. Okay, you can't see my face, but I'll just show this comment today. But yeah, absolutely, positive comments can cause harm. So actually, we kind of think that, yeah, if this is positive, this isn't going to be a harmful thing, but actually, it can actually set people up for harm. South Asian men also do not lift South Asian women, which is something we need to talk about. There are so many conversations we need to have, Hannah, and that's a really important one. I wrote a post recently about some of the conversations around the interlink between anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism, and the links and some of the more nuanced conversations we need to have. But then there are also conversations within South Asian communities that we need to have as well. And gender, my article didn't go into this, but this is absolutely essential. There are so many conversations that need to be had, and these aren't really, a spotlight isn't really shone on them. Yeah. And there are really some dangerous situations happening right now. And I read an article recently. I'm going to give a donation for doing this talk to a charity that supports South Asian communities. I will pop some links below as well if you would like to donate. And an article I read was about domestic violence. So there are some real conversations we also need to be having within our communities. Rena, you're the one that left. It got too much and decided to go it alone, and being scarred by racism. Yeah, absolutely. These are wounds that are really hard to heal from. Really, really challenging. And you are not alone. We kind of went over it today that there are 3/4 of women of colour that are feeling like you are experiencing this. And what we go through at work is workplace trauma, especially when racism is involved. And it absolutely does leave a lasting mark. And this is why it's really important that organisations are addressing these challenges and rooting out racism, rooting out gender discrimination and racism and the interlink between them. Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to pick up the last comment, unless anybody has any more, any tools or models to equip better to help South Asian diversity and protect ourselves from unconscious and conscious bias? Tira, that's a really good question. So equip us better to help promote South Asian diversity. I think that using South Asian Heritage Month is a positive thing. Of course, it's only 1 month of the year. It's fairly new. So not many organisations are leaning into it or celebrating it or using it as an instigator for conversations, but more are. I'm seeing organisations and I'm working with organisations who have very specific employee network groups that aren't just under the BAME umbrella. Some are very specific, some are Black network groups, some are Asian network groups, some are South Asian network groups, some are Hindu network groups, some are Sikh network groups. So again, it depends on the organisation if that's appropriate, or if you've got a diverse enough community for that. But that is one way that you can create that more community amongst peers. But that's of course not enough. We need to look at leadership, middle management. What interventions are you putting in place to support your South Asian community? Because their needs, it may be similar in some respects to other people of colour, but in other respects they are not the same. So we need to get nuanced and specific about this, and this is one of the conversations that I come in and support organisations around. And as a South Asian, what can we do to protect ourselves from unconscious and conscious bias? Really, really good question. Again, just touching on this because this is a really deep conversation. I don't know that there is an easy way. I think an awareness of it, understanding that you're not alone is incredibly important. Having a community and these network groups can be really important for that. Being able to speak out, even though we've already said there are risks with that and there can sometimes quite justifiable risks, but feeling like you're in a space that you are able to speak out, then that is incredibly important. And knowing that you have options. In some cases, perhaps you do have to walk with your feet and you have to leave organisations or leave certain environments. That's not always possible for people, but where you have got those options, then we don't have to stay in places where we are suffering and very overt or even not overt series of prejudices. So where we have power and can walk with our feet, we can build our own tables, then let's do that. But in the meantime, also, let's raise the awareness, let's challenge the systems and break them down. Are we better tackling discrimination one group at a time or together? That's a really great question. Hannah has given a great answer as well. We can't do one group at a time because everyone is intersectional and everyone is important. And yeah, absolutely. So there is a real focus at the moment since 2020, and actually perhaps that conversation is dying down around Black Lives Matter, but it still absolutely needs to be in our prominent thought and action and intervention of anti-Black racism. There are lots of work that's been done on gender equality, but treating these two issues as separate means that so many people are missed. It's meant that gender equity initiatives are often only really supporting white women. So we really do need to be intersectional. We need to focus on anti-Black racism, but we also need to look at anti-Asian racism. We also need to look at the links between anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism, as well as so many other conversations. And I can understand that this can be really overwhelming. And it's very complex. So we need to be able to break it down and be able to focus on what are the priority areas for the organisations. We also, a really powerful way is to look at the people that are most underrepresented or most marginalised. So if we look at particular people that are perhaps, so an example that maybe is a Black woman who has disabilities and neurodiversity, they will have marginalisation from multiple different angles. So if we can create an equitable workplace that is meeting the needs of people with multiple marginalized identities, then we will be actually doing better for other people as well. So I'm going to round up the conversation now, and I will invite you to message me in the comments if you've got any more that you'd like to expand on, or pop me a direct message. If you'd like to pick up this conversation into your workplace, I would love to speak to you about that as well. So have a lovely afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being with me for this half an hour. And I would love to hear any thoughts you had, or anything you've learned today, or anything that you are going to take away. I will pop back into the comments and pick those up. So thank you all. Thank you very much.